The turkey had been carved perfectly. I remember that detail clearly. The way my father had stood at the head of the table with that long silver knife, each slice deliberate and clean, laid out in neat rows on the ceramic platter my parents had received as a wedding gift 31 years ago. The candles flickered in the center of the table, casting warm shadows across the faces of people who had known me my entire life. The smell of roasted sage and buttered rolls filled the dining room the way it always had every fourth Thursday of November. Everything looked exactly the way a family Thanksgiving was supposed to look, which made what happened next feel even more surgical. My mother set down her wine glass with a small, precise clink and folded her hands in her lap. She had the expression she always used when she was delivering something she had already decided was reasonable. Chin slightly lifted, lips pressed into a shape that was almost a smile, but carried no warmth behind it. "We need to talk about Christmas," she said. "We've decided to keep it smaller this year." My husband Daniel was sitting beside me. Beneath the tablecloth, his hand found my knee. My father cleared his throat. "Marcus's fiancée comes from a very traditional family. Her parents will be joining us, along with a few colleagues of her father's, important people." He paused to take a measured sip of water. "We're curating the gathering carefully. We just think, given your current work situation, it would be better for everyone if you and Daniel celebrated separately this year." The table went quiet. Not the comfortable kind of quiet that settles over a meal, the other kind, the kind that has weight. I looked at my brother Marcus across the table. He was cutting his turkey with great concentration, eyes fixed on his plate. But I saw it. The almost imperceptible release of tension in his shoulders. The slight relaxation of his jaw. He had known this was coming. He had, in all likelihood, requested it. "My work situation," I repeated. My voice was completely level. "You know what we mean," my mother said, her tone carrying that particular coating of apology that contained no actual apology. "It's not about us. We're just protecting the family image. These are people Marcus needs to impress. His future in-laws. His career depends on these relationships. We're just protecting the family image." My father said it again, as though repetition would soften the meaning or perhaps help me understand a concept he believed I was too slow to grasp. He then resumed eating, as if the matter had been closed with a gentle efficiency he found entirely satisfying. Marcus's fiancée, a quiet woman named Claire, who I had met only twice, kept her eyes on her plate. Her cheeks had gone slightly pink. Whatever she knew or didn't know about this arrangement, she had the decency to look uncomfortable. I cut a small piece of turkey. I chewed it slowly. The sage in the stuffing was slightly over-seasoned, too much salt, but the meat itself was tender and well-rested. I noticed these details the way I had trained myself to notice things in difficult moments, precisely, without emotional interference, cataloging instead of collapsing. Daniel's hand under the table had tightened until I could feel every knuckle. I reached down and placed my fingers lightly over his. A signal. "I'm fine. Don't." "Of course," I said pleasantly. "Whatever works best for everyone." My mother exhaled and reached for her wine with the practiced relief of a woman who had expected resistance and received none. She interpreted my composure as acceptance. She always had. It was, perhaps, the most consistent mistake she had ever made with me. The conversation moved on. Someone commented on the sweet potato casserole. Marcus finally looked up from his plate and rejoined the table as though nothing unusual had occurred, describing the venue they were considering for the wedding with the enthusiasm of a man who had just had a splinter quietly removed. I sat in the candlelight and listened. I smiled at the appropriate moments. I answered questions about nothing that mattered. And behind my steady eyes, I ran the numbers I had been quietly running for 4 years. The contracts, the retained accounts, the compounding revenue that no one at this table had thought to ask about because they had already decided what I was. The candles burned, the silverware clinked, the wine was poured a second time. What my parents didn't know was that I had spent the last 4 years building an empire in complete silence, one that could destroy everything they were trying to protect.
I want to pause here for a moment, right here, before the table goes silent and before my husband says the words that made my mother set down her wine glass and never quite pick it up again that evening. Because what happened next is the part that changes everything. The quiet decision I had already made before I even walked through that front door. The number my husband placed in the center of that dinner table, like a single card laid face up at the end of a very long game. I'll tell you all of it. But I need something from you first. If you have ever been excluded by your own family, uninvited, quietly removed from a table you grew up eating at, handed a polite explanation that was really just a dressed-up dismissal, like this video right now. Not for the algorithm, not for me. Like it because you deserve to mark the moment you recognized your own story in someone else's. Like it because silence has been the default for too long, and a single tap is sometimes the first honest thing a person does all day. And drop a comment. Tell me your location and the exact time where you're watching this. I read them. All of them. There is something I find quietly powerful about knowing that someone in a different city, a different country, a different time zone entirely, is sitting with this story at 2 in the afternoon or 11 at night and thinking, yes, that happened to me too. I'll wait. Now, to understand why that Thanksgiving rejection landed the way it did, and why my reaction was so different from what my family had come to expect from me, you need to understand what the 4 years leading up to that dinner actually looked like. Not the version my parents had constructed in their minds, the convenient, summarized version they repeated at gatherings when someone asked how I was doing. The real version. The one that happened in early mornings and late nights and calculated decisions made in complete, deliberate silence, while the people at that table were busy deciding what I was worth. To understand the ending, you need to know exactly what I was building, while they were perfecting the art of being ashamed of me. The pattern did not begin dramatically. That is the thing about systematic erasure. It rarely does. It begins in small, almost deniable moments. A dinner you were not called about until after it happened. A family photograph where the framing was slightly adjusted. A conversation that stopped just as you walked into the room. In January of 2021, I did not recognize these moments as a pattern. I simply noticed them the way you notice a recurring sound in a building. Present, slightly wrong, but not yet urgent enough to investigate. I had just turned 29. Daniel and I had been married for 2 years and were living in a modest 2-bedroom apartment in the city, the kind of place with good light and thin walls, and a kitchen that required creative spatial reasoning. I had spent the previous 6 years working in digital marketing for other people's companies, managing social media campaigns, building content strategies, running paid advertising for brands that paid me adequately, but owned everything I produced. I was competent at it. I was, by most measures, excellent at it. But I had been watching the industry shift for several years, and by late 2020, I had identified something specific. Mid-sized brands and individual creators were generating enormous revenue online, but had no sophisticated infrastructure for content strategy, audience monetization, or long-term digital brand building. They needed what I knew how to do. They simply needed it delivered differently. In February of 2021, I registered Luck Circle Digital as an LLC and began taking my first 3 clients. I told my family at Easter that year. My mother asked if it was like making TikToks. My father nodded slowly in the way he nodded when he had already categorized something as a phase and was simply waiting for it to resolve. Marcus, who was then 2 years into his position at a mid-tier investment firm, and had recently begun wearing the particular expression of a man who considers his professional identity fragile and therefore precious, looked up from his plate and said, "Digital marketing is a saturated space. You should think about stability." I said I had thought about it extensively. He said, "I just don't want your side project affecting how people see our family." I noted the phrase, side project. I noted it and said nothing and passed the bread rolls. By the end of 2021, Luck Circle had generated $214,000 in gross revenue. I had 5 clients on retainer, 2 of whom had come through referrals, which meant the work was compounding. I had hired 1 part-time contractor. I had moved us into a better apartment. I did not share these numbers with my family because I had already understood by then that the numbers would not change the category they had placed me in. In their architecture, the category came first. The evidence was arranged around it afterward. This is not a cynical observation, it is a sociological one. Pierre Bourdieu spent decades documenting the mechanisms by which families and social groups assign prestige, not primarily based on income, but based on the cultural legibility of how that income is earned. His concept of cultural capital explains precisely why a school teacher earning $47,000 annually ranks higher in family esteem than an entrepreneur earning 4 times that amount through channels the family cannot easily explain at a dinner party. The NORC General Social Survey's occupational prestige rankings, which have been conducted and updated since 1972, consistently show that prestige scores correlate less with compensation than with perceived social contribution and institutional affiliation. A position at a recognizable firm with a recognizable title produces prestige. Work that exists outside institutional frameworks, regardless of its sophistication or profitability, produces suspicion. My family was not unusual. They were simply acting precisely within documented human patterns. What made their particular version of this pattern damaging was not the dismissal itself. It was the selective application of it. In March of 2021, my mother called to ask if Daniel and I could lend her and my father $23,000 to cover a shortfall on a property tax bill they had not planned for adequately. She used the word lend with complete sincerity. I transferred the money within 48 hours because they were my parents, and because I had it, and because the version of myself that had been raised in that house still operated on the premise that family meant reciprocity. I did not ask for documentation. I did not set a repayment timeline beyond my mother's vague assurance that they would sort it out by summer. Summer came and passed without mention of it. In September of 2021, Marcus called, not to catch up, but to ask if I could cover 6 months of his car payments while he redirected his cash flow toward a down payment on a condo he was purchasing slightly beyond his means. He framed it as a temporary inconvenience. He used the phrase, "You know how it is," in a way that implied he believed I did not, in fact, know how it was, but that invoking the phrase was sufficient social currency to proceed. The total amount was $8,400. I covered it. He did not repay it. When I raised it gently 8 months later, he said he thought we had moved past that and changed the subject to his firm's quarterly performance. I want to be precise about the total, because precision matters and because I spent considerable time with these numbers later when clarity became necessary. Between March of 2021 and November of 2024, the money I extended to my family, to my parents, and to Marcus across 7 separate requests totaled $187,000. This figure includes the initial property tax transfer, Marcus's car payments, a $45,000 contribution toward my parents' kitchen renovation in 2022 that was described to me as an investment in the family home and never formalized in any document. $31,000 my mother requested over 3 separate calls in 2023 for reasons that shifted slightly each time, and several smaller transfers I had initially not tracked carefully enough, which I reconstructed later from bank records. Not $1 was repaid. Not one repayment was ever seriously proposed. And through all of it, through every transfer, every covered shortfall, every request answered without hesitation, my career remained, in my family's shared language, something between a hobby and an embarrassment. In June of 2022, my parents hosted a dinner for my father's colleagues and their spouses. I was not invited. When I found out through a passing comment my mother made a week later, she said it had been a professional gathering and that my freelance situation would have been difficult to explain. I asked what specifically would have been difficult. She said, "People ask what you do, and there's no simple answer, and it makes everyone uncomfortable." I told her I ran a digital media agency with 11 active clients. She said, "Yes, but it's hard to explain what that means." In November of 2022, I was uninvited from Thanksgiving for the first time. The explanation given was that Marcus was bringing a colleague from his firm and wanted to keep the conversation focused. I spent that Thanksgiving with Daniel's family, who asked about my work with genuine curiosity and listened to my answers without visible discomfort. I noted the difference carefully. In April of 2023, Marcus called me directly, which he rarely did without a specific agenda, to tell me that his firm had recently merged with a larger financial group and that his visibility internally had increased. He said he needed me to understand that optics matter more now than ever, and that if I was going to continue doing whatever it is you do online, he would appreciate it if I did not mention his name in any professional context. I asked him to clarify what he meant. He said he just wanted to be careful. I asked, careful about what specifically? He said, people Google things and connections come up, and I've worked hard to build a certain reputation. I told him I understood. I told him I would not connect his name to my work in any professional context. What I did not tell him was that by April of 2023, Lux Circle had 17 retained clients, 2 full-time employees, 1 part-time contractor, and a trailing 12-month revenue figure that had crossed $1.1 million for the first time. I did not tell him because I had already understood that telling him would not produce respect. It would produce a new category of threat, which would produce a new category of management strategy aimed at me. I had watched the pattern long enough to know its next moves before it made them. In August of 2023, my mother called to tell me that Marcus was being considered for a senior associate position, and that the family needed to present well at an upcoming firm event she and my father had been invited to attend. She asked if Daniel and I would be willing to skip the family holiday gathering that December so that Marcus could focus without distractions. The word distractions landed in my chest like a stone dropped into still water. I told her that was fine. I said it calmly, with no elaboration, and I meant it, but not in the way she interpreted my compliance. By December of 2023, I had stopped arguing entirely. I had stopped correcting the dismissals, stopped offering the revenue figures, stopped explaining the client roster or the contracts or the infrastructure I had spent 3 years building with disciplined, methodical precision. I had stopped because I had finally accepted something that took longer to accept than it should have. The argument was never about evidence. The verdict had been issued before any evidence existed. Everything I offered in my defense was simply sorted into the pre-existing category and filed away without changing the conclusion. So I stopped defending, and I started building differently, not frantically, not angrily, but with the particular quality of focus that arrives when you finally stop spending energy on a door that will not open and redirect it entirely toward what you are constructing in the room behind you. I hired a second full-time employee in January of 2024. I restructured 2 anchor contracts to include equity-adjacent performance clauses that increase their long-term value significantly. I began a quiet acquisition of a smaller content firm whose client list complemented mine without overlap. I said nothing to my family about any of it. I answered their calls, I deflected their questions with pleasantries. I showed up where I was invited and was absent where I was not. And I gave no indication that anything had changed in how I thought about any of it. The Thanksgiving of 2024 was not the beginning of anything. It was simply the moment the distance between what my family believed and what was actually true became too large to remain invisible. I had known for some time that it would become visible eventually. I had simply decided, in the quiet of December 2023, to choose the moment myself. The first layer was the one no one saw coming, not because I had hidden it with any particular drama, but because the people who might have noticed were too busy underestimating me to look carefully at what I was doing in plain sight. By January of 2023, Lux Circle Digital had 17 retained clients. By January of 2024, that number had grown to 31. But the number itself was never the significant detail. The significant detail was who, specifically, was on that roster, and why their presence there would eventually matter in ways that extended far beyond revenue. I had built my client acquisition strategy around a specific thesis. The professionals most likely to need sophisticated digital brand infrastructure were not startup founders or influencers chasing follower counts. They were senior executives at institutional firms, the kind of people whose personal brands were becoming increasingly inseparable from their professional authority, whose boards and partners expected them to have a coherent public presence, but who had neither the time nor the specialized knowledge to build one themselves. These were cautious, private, reputation-conscious people. They did not respond to cold outreach. They responded to referrals from people they already trusted, delivered in contexts where discretion was implicit. I spent 14 months building those referral pathways with the patience of someone who understands that infrastructure takes longer than product. By March of 2024, 11 of my 31 retained clients were senior executives at financial services firms operating in the same institutional ecosystem my brother Marcus moved through daily. I want to be precise here, because precision is what separates a compelling claim from a documented fact. 3 of those 11 clients were individuals Marcus had mentioned by name in conversations over the preceding 2 years. Once as a managing director whose approval he was seeking for an internal promotion, once as an investor his firm was actively cultivating, and once as a senior partner at an affiliated firm whose opinion, Marcus had said with considerable reverence, basically determines careers in this space. All 3 had retained Luck Circle before I made that connection consciously. The first had come through a referral from a previous client in late 2022. The second had found me through an industry introduction at a conference I had attended in Chicago in early 2023. The third had been referred directly by the first after a private recommendation I was not present for, and only learned about through the onboarding conversation. I had not engineered these relationships to intersect with Marcus's world. I had engineered them to serve a specific professional demographic, and that demographic turned out to overlap significantly with the ecosystem my family had spent 3 years deciding I was unqualified to be adjacent to. I noted this overlap in February of 2024, when reviewing my client roster against some details Marcus had mentioned over the previous months. I noted it calmly, the way you note the weather before deciding what to wear. And then I continued doing excellent work for every client on that list, because the quality of the work was always the point, and because the relationships I had built were founded entirely on professional merit and contractual clarity. Every client engagement at Luck Circle operated under a master services agreement structured around 3 core elements: a 90-day minimum engagement term with automatic renewal, a confidentiality clause that ran bilaterally, protecting both the client's information and my firm's methodologies, and a performance framework tied to measurable deliverables rather than hours logged. This last element was deliberate. Billing by deliverable rather than by time positions an agency as a strategic partner rather than a vendor. It changes the power dynamic of the relationship, the renewal conversation, and the referral behavior of satisfied clients. By mid-2024, my client retention rate over a rolling 12-month period was 94%. In an industry where 60% retention is considered healthy, this number was the quiet foundation of everything else. The second layer was less visible than the first, and, in terms of long-term structural value, considerably more significant. In November of 2022, I had begun building what I described internally as a talent pipeline, a systematic approach to identifying, onboarding, and managing digital creators whose content output could be optimized through professional strategy, brand positioning, and monetization infrastructure. This was not influencer management in the conventional sense. I was not interested in personalities chasing brand deals. I was interested in subject matter experts, professionals, academics, practitioners in specialized fields, who had genuine knowledge audiences and were leaving significant revenue on the table through unsophisticated content strategy. By October of 2024, Luck Circle managed 87 creators across 14 verticals. The talent roster included professionals in finance, architecture, medicine, law, and technology. People with credibility-based audiences who converted at rates consumer influencers rarely achieved. The average managed creator on my roster generated 340% more revenue in their first 12 months with Luck Circle than in the 12 months preceding their onboarding. This figure came from internal performance tracking I had formalized in a quarterly reporting structure beginning in early 2023. The pipeline feeding this roster was built through partnerships with career development offices at 7 universities. 4 of them ranked within the top 30 nationally, which I had cultivated beginning in January of 2023 through a program I designed and funded myself. Luck Circle offered a structured 10-week digital brand accelerator for graduate students and early career professionals, provided at no cost to participants, in exchange for non-exclusive first-look agreements on managed representation for graduates who met our criteria. The program cost me approximately $40,000 annually to operate. The pipeline it generated had, by the end of 2024, produced 19 active managed creators, whose collective annual revenue under management exceeded $2.3 million. My parents believed I managed social media accounts. I did not correct them. The third layer was the one that took the longest to build, and the one that will take the longest for people outside the industry to fully understand, which is precisely why I want to explain it carefully. In September of 2022, I was introduced through a professional contact to a small software development firm called Archon Systems, which had spent 3 years building a back-end content management and monetization platform designed specifically for creator economy infrastructure. The platform handled multi-channel publishing, revenue aggregation across platforms, contract management, rights tracking, and analytics in a single integrated system. It was technically sophisticated, practically essential for anyone managing creators at scale, and almost entirely unknown outside a small network of early adopters who had found it through word of mouth. Archon had 3 founders, a team of 11 developers, and a revenue problem. The product was genuinely excellent. The go-to-market strategy was not. They understood software architecture with precision, and understood sales and positioning with almost none. I spent 4 months evaluating the platform, stress testing it against my own operational needs, interviewing their existing users, and reviewing their financial structure. In January of 2023, I made an initial investment of $180,000 for a 22% equity stake in Archon Systems, structured as a Delaware C corporation with a formal shareholder agreement, anti-dilution provisions, and a board observer seat that converted to a full voting board seat upon my stake crossing 25%. I crossed 25% in August of 2023 through a follow-on investment of $95,000, triggered by a secondary share purchase from one of the original founders who was exiting. I took my full board seat in September of 2023. By the time I sat at that Thanksgiving table in November of 2024, I held 42% of Archon Systems, making me the single largest individual shareholder in a platform that, by conservative third-party valuation conducted in June of 2024, was worth $11.3 million. The platform was processing content operations for over 400 agencies and individual creators. Lux Circle's operational efficiency, the reason my margins were consistently higher than industry benchmarks, was directly attributable to having both built my workflows around this platform and owned a meaningful piece of it. The combined financial picture by the close of 2024 was as follows. Lux Circle Digital was generating $4.2 million in annual revenue against operating costs that my restructured contract model kept disciplined. Net margin was 34%, which translated to approximately $1.43 million in annual profit. The Archon equity at the June valuation represented a paper asset of $4.75 million. I had 2 full-time employees, 3 part-time contractors, and an operational infrastructure that had been built, refined, and stress-tested over 4 years of consecutive growth. My family, during this same period, had requested and received $187,000 from me, referred to my career consistently as my online thing, excluded me from 3 family events on the grounds that my professional identity was too difficult to explain, and most recently determined that my presence at Christmas dinner would constitute an embarrassment to the family image they were carefully curating for Marcus's fiancée's conservative family. I want to be precise about something, because I think it matters for understanding what came next and why it unfolded the way it did. At no point during these 4 years did I build anything with the primary motivation of proving my family wrong. The motivation was always the business, the clients, the creators, the platform, the margins, the compounding logic of building something real in a space I understood better than almost anyone else who was operating in it. The work came first. The numbers were a consequence of the work. What I had done, slowly and without announcing it, was simply continue building while they continued deciding. And by November of 2024, the distance between what they had decided and what was actually true had become so structurally significant that it could not survive contact with reality indefinitely. I had known this for some time. I had simply been waiting for the right moment and the right person to deliver the information, to let reality into the room. The dinner had continued the way dinners like this always continue, on the surface, without interruption, as though the thing that had just been said had been quietly absorbed into the wallpaper and neutralized. The sweet potato casserole was passed to the left. Someone refilled the water glasses. My mother asked Claire about the wedding venue they were considering with the warm, invested curiosity she reserved for people whose opinions she was actively courting. I ate methodically, small bites, measured intervals. The candles had burned down perhaps a quarter of an inch since we had sat down, which meant we had been at this table for approximately 40 minutes. I tracked details like this without meaning to. It was a habit I had developed over years of sitting in rooms where the official version of events and the actual version of events existed in the same space simultaneously, and precision was the only reliable anchor. It was Marcus who returned to it. I had expected silence to hold for the remainder of the meal, but Marcus had always been constitutionally uncomfortable with unresolved tension, which he typically resolved by consolidating it into something that felt like resolution, but was actually just dominance wearing a reasonable expression. He set down his fork with a small, deliberate placement and looked at my parents with the expression of a man delivering a toast. I just want to say, I know it wasn't an easy call, but I really appreciate you both thinking about the bigger picture here. He paused for exactly the right amount of time. The holidays are important for Claire's family, and having everything feel cohesive and professional, it matters. It reflects on all of us. He glanced briefly in my direction and then back to my parents with a small nod. So, thank you for protecting that. Protecting his future. That was the phrase. Delivered with sincerity, with the particular warmth of a man who had mistaken the absence of resistance for the absence of awareness. My father nodded once, the nod of a man whose decision had just been publicly validated and found satisfying. My mother smiled and reached over to briefly touch Marcus's hand, the gesture so practiced it had become reflex. Claire looked at her plate. I cut a piece of roasted carrot into 2 precise halves and moved them to the edge of my plate. My breathing was even. My posture was what it had been since I sat down, straight, relaxed, giving nothing away. I had spent 4 years learning to make composure indistinguishable from indifference, and the lesson had taken well. What I did not do was look at Daniel. Not yet. We had spoken about this possibility, not this specific dinner, but the category of moment it represented. The moment when the pattern announced itself so cleanly, so completely without ambiguity, that waiting any longer served no purpose. We had agreed on a signal months ago, during a quiet evening when I had walked him through the Archon valuation documents and the Lux Circle year-end projections, and he had sat with the numbers for a long time before looking up and saying, "They have no idea, do they?" It was not a question. The signal was simple. When I was ready, I would look at him directly and set my fork down on the right side of my plate rather than the left. I listened to Marcus accept my family's gratitude for engineering my exclusion. I listened to my father say once more that these things were about the bigger picture. I listened to my mother steer the conversation gently back toward the wedding, toward Claire's family, toward the version of this family she was carefully assembling for public presentation. And then I set my fork down on the right side of my plate. I looked at Daniel. He looked back at me with the calm, quiet recognition of someone who had been waiting for exactly this moment and was entirely prepared for what came next. Daniel did not raise his voice. He did not lean forward with aggression or perform the moment in any way that telegraphed what was inside the folder he placed on the table beside his dinner plate. He simply set it down the way you set down something that belongs there. Without ceremony, without apology, with the quiet confidence of a man who has been patient for a very long time and has finally decided that patience has served its full purpose. The folder was dark blue, rigid, the kind used for formal document presentation. He had printed everything 2 days before Thanksgiving, organized it into tab sections, and left it in the car until we walked in. I had not touched it once during dinner. I had not needed to. "I want to share a few things," Daniel said. His voice was conversational, measured. the voice of someone making an observation rather than an accusation. I think there's some information that would be useful for everyone at this table to have. My mother's smile held its shape for approximately 3 seconds before something behind it shifted. My father set down his fork. Marcus looked at the folder with the expression of a man who has heard an unfamiliar sound in a building he believed he understood completely. Daniel opened to the first tab. Lux Circle Digital, he said, generated $4.2 million in revenue in the fiscal year ending October 2024. Net margin of 34%. That's approximately $1.43 million in profit. He turned the first page so it faced the center of the table. A printed revenue summary, line-itemed and clean, with the firm's registered Delaware C Corporation number visible in the header. This is the most recent annual summary. The accountant's signature is on page 2. No one spoke. He moved to the second tab. Client roster. Partial. The full list is confidential under active NDAs, which I'll explain in a moment, but I've included the entries relevant to this conversation. He turned the page. Robert Callahan, Managing Director. He paused to let the name settle. Marcus's jaw tightened incrementally, a movement so small that someone not watching for it would have missed it entirely. Thomas Wren, Senior Investor, Meridian Group. Another pause. And Philip Hargrove, Senior Partner, Callahan Meridian Alliance. The color in Marcus's face did not drain dramatically. It receded in the way heat leaves a room when a window opens, gradually, then with a completeness that made the room feel different than it had before. These were not peripheral names. I knew this because Marcus had said Philip Hargrove's name to me with a reverence he reserved for perhaps 4 people on the planet. He had said in March of 2023 that Hargrove's opinion basically determined careers in this space. All 3 had been retained Lux Circle clients for over a year. All 3 had signed master services agreements that included the bilateral confidentiality clause I used in every engagement, which meant that none of them had disclosed our working relationship to anyone at Marcus's firm. And Marcus had spent the last 12 months navigating his professional world in complete ignorance of the fact that his sister had been serving the people whose approval he was most carefully cultivating. These 3 individuals, Daniel continued, are active retained clients, contracted, invoiced monthly. The relationship predates this dinner by 14, 16, and 19 months, respectively. He turned a page to show the contract cover sheets. Client name, engagement start date, monthly retainer figure, signature line. The specific dollar amounts were redacted in accordance with confidentiality terms. The names, the dates, and the structure were not. My father said, "What is this?" It was not a question. It was the sound a person makes when the architecture of a belief they have held for years develops a crack too large to explain away. Daniel moved to the third tab. Archon Systems, he said. Delaware C Corporation, incorporated in 2019. Back-end content management and monetization platform. The industry infrastructure that the majority of mid to large digital agencies and creator management firms currently run on. He turned the page to show the shareholder registry, which listed my name, the percentage figure, and the date of the original investment. Current ownership, 42%, held by my wife. Largest individual shareholder, full voting board seat, held since September 2023. He let that sit for a moment before continuing. Archon's June 2024 independent valuation placed the company at $11.3 million. Her stake represents approximately $4.75 million in equity at that figure. He turned to a printed copy of the valuation summary, third-party letterhead visible at the top. The platform currently services over 400 agencies, including, and I want to be specific here, he turned one more page, 3 firms operating within the same institutional network as Marcus's employer, whose content and communications infrastructure runs on Archon's backend. Their contract with Archon predates any awareness they had of the ownership structure. The table was completely silent. Not the silence of a pause between sentences. The silence of a room in which every person present is simultaneously recalculating something they had believed was settled. Marcus had not moved. His hands were flat on the table on either side of his plate. His face had completed its recession into something I had never seen on him before. Not anger, not defensiveness, but the specific, unmistakable expression of a person who has just understood that the ground they were standing on was never what they thought it was. Daniel closed the folder without drama and rested his hand on top of it. There are also bank records here, he said. Transfer records specifically. Every transfer my wife made to this family over the last 4 years. 47,000 in 2021. 63,000 in 2022. 51,000 in 2023. 31,000 in the first 8 months of 2024. Total $187,000. All outgoing, none returned. He said it without inflection, the way you read coordinates from a map. I'm not raising that to create conflict. I'm raising it because I think the complete picture is relevant. My mother's hand was resting on the table near her wine glass, but not touching it. My father was looking at the folder with an expression I could not fully read, something between shock and the early, uncomfortable arrival of shame. I had not spoken since Daniel opened the folder. I had not needed to. I picked up my water glass and took a quiet sip and set it back down precisely where it had been, and I looked at my brother across the table with the same composure I had brought to every dinner, every dismissal, every phone call where the request for money and the confirmation of my irrelevance had arrived in the same breath. Marcus opened his mouth once and closed it. The candles were still burning. The turkey platter was still centered on the table. Everything in the room was exactly where it had been 20 minutes ago, and absolutely nothing was the same. The folder remained on the table. Daniel had not moved it. No one had reached for it or pushed it away, and its presence in the center of that careful, curated dinner had the quality of something that had permanently altered the room's geometry, simply by existing in it. I set my napkin beside my plate and folded my hands in my lap. When I spoke, my voice was the same voice I had used all evening, level, unhurried, giving no indication that what I was about to say had been drafted, reviewed, and refined over the course of several quiet evenings in the past 2 months. I want to be clear about something before I say the rest of this, I began. This is not about tonight. Tonight is simply the moment I chose to have a conversation that has been waiting to happen for a long time. What I'm going to propose is a business matter. I'd like everyone to hear it that way. My father looked at me with an expression that was still recalibrating. My mother had not touched her wine. Marcus was watching me with the careful stillness of someone who has just understood that the rules of the room have changed and has not yet determined what the new rules are. I placed a second folder on the table, thinner than Daniel's, pale gray, 3 copies inside, one for my parents, one for Marcus, one to remain with me. Luck Circle is at an inflection point, I said. The client base, the talent roster, and the Archon equity have created a foundation that supports significant expansion. What the firm needs at this stage is institutional credibility, the kind that comes from formal partnership structures and aligned professional relationships. I paused. Marcus's firm has the institutional profile. Luck Circle has the revenue, the infrastructure, and 3 of its most significant client relationships. A merger creates value for both sides. I've had this assessed independently, and the structure is sound. I opened my copy of the folder. The proposal is a formal merger creating a new parent entity. Luck Circle Digital Partners, registered in Delaware. I come in as managing partner with 60% equity. Marcus's existing professional relationships and institutional affiliation contribute the remaining 40. All existing Luck Circle contracts, the Archon equity stake, and the full talent roster transfer into the new structure under my continued management authority. Marcus's role would be defined, salaried, and bounded by a formal operating agreement. He would not have unilateral decision-making authority in any area of operations. No one interrupted. I continued. The Archon board seat remains mine. Client relationships I have built are not transferable without individual client consent, which I would seek through the standard onboarding transition process. Any client who chooses not to transition remains with Luck Circle's legacy structure, which I retain regardless of whether this merger proceeds. I looked at Marcus directly. His expression had moved through several stages in the last 4 minutes and had arrived somewhere that was difficult to name. Not quite humility, not quite acceptance, but the early, uncomfortable precondition of both. This is a serious offer, I said. It is not a gesture, and it is not conditional on anything other than the four terms I'm about to outline. These are not negotiable. I want to say that clearly so we don't spend time in a conversation about whether they are. I turned the page. First, there will be no further financial transfers from me to any member of this family outside of a formal, documented, interest-bearing loan agreement reviewed by both parties' legal counsel. The $187,000 already extended is not part of this negotiation. It is documented. It exists. What happens with it is a separate conversation for a separate time. But it ends here as a pattern. My mother drew a small breath. I did not pause. Second, my professional identity, my firm, and my work are not subjects for family editorial. They are not discussed as embarrassments, explained away at dinner tables, or used as reasons for my exclusion from family events. If the professional relationship proceeds, the personal relationship proceeds on the same terms. Both or neither. Third, any professional collaboration between myself and Marcus operates entirely within the structure of the operating agreement. There are no informal requests, no favors extended on the basis of family connection, and no expectation that family loyalty substitutes for professional accountability. We are colleagues in this structure, governed by a contract, evaluated by results. Fourth, Claire is welcome at any family gathering I attend. Her family's values are her family's values. They are not a metric by which my presence is measured or my invitation is issued. I extend the same courtesy in return. I have no interest in anyone's personal beliefs becoming professional criteria in either direction. I closed my copy of the folder and set it flat on the table with both hands resting on top of it. I want to be honest about what this is and what it isn't, I said. This is not revenge. If I wanted to cause damage, the Archon information alone creates several avenues I have no interest in pursuing. This is a business proposal made from a position of clarity. I have built something real. I am offering a structure that extends its value to people who have not, until now, treated that work with any seriousness. That is the offer. It will remain open for 30 days from tonight. I looked around the table, at my father's careful stillness, at my mother's hands folded too tightly in her lap, at Claire, who was watching me with an expression that contained, I thought, something close to quiet recognition. And then I looked at Marcus. He was looking at the gray folder in front of him. After a long moment, he reached out and opened it to the first page. That was enough for tonight. The silence that followed lasted longer than silences usually do at dinner tables. It had a different quality than the silence after Daniel opened the first folder. That had been the silence of shock, of recalculation. This one was quieter and more personal. The silence of people sitting with something they could not unknow about themselves. My father spoke first. He did not offer an explanation or a defense. He looked at the gray folder and then at me and said, "We didn't see it." 4 words. Simple and insufficient and, I believed, genuine. My mother pressed her fingers briefly against her mouth. When she lowered her hand, her eyes were bright in a way she was working to control. She did not say anything for a long moment, and then she said, "I'm sorry." Just that, no qualification attached. Marcus was last. He had read the first 4 pages of the merger proposal with the focused attention of someone who had spent enough years in professional environments to understand exactly what he was reading. When he looked up, the version of his face I had grown up with, the one that had learned early to perform confidence as a substitute for security, was largely absent. What remained was simpler and considerably more honest. "I've been unfair to you," he said quietly, "for a long time. I knew it while I was doing it, and I told myself it was practical." He paused. It wasn't practical. It was small. I looked at him for a moment. I nodded once. It was not forgiveness, and it was not dismissal. It was acknowledgement. The recognition that the words had been said and received, and that what happened next would be determined by what followed them, not by the words themselves. 3 months later, Lux Circle Digital Partners filed its operating agreement with the state of Delaware on a Tuesday morning in February. The merged entity launched with 31 retained clients, 87 managed creators, the full Archon equity position, and a combined institutional profile that placed it among the top 40 digital brand management firms in the country by revenue. I signed as managing partner. The office was mine. The structure was mine. The direction was mine. The work, as it had always been, was simply the work. There are things I know now with a clarity that 4 years of building in silence will give you if you let it. Your value does not require an audience to be real. It compounds in the dark the same way it compounds in the light. The people who exclude you from the table are rarely protecting something important. They are usually protecting something fragile. Money given to people who diminish you is not generosity. It is a negotiation you are conducting with yourself about what you are willing to accept. Boundaries are not walls. They are the accurate description of where you end and where the cost of disrespecting you begins. And the last thing, the one I return to most often in quiet moments when the work is good and the numbers are clean, and the life I built from scratch is running exactly as designed. They didn't invite me to Thanksgiving because they were ashamed of my job. Now they work for the woman they were ashamed of.